challenge is of external that Africa itself can hardly manage. Now turn to the opportunities. In my personal view, there are also three key opportunities for China-Africa security cooperation. The first, Africa needs for external support and all international public goods keep growing. This is due to the increase in security challenges and also the shrinking of available resources in Africa. The second opportunity is that China's ability and willingness to provide international security public goods keep growing. Most importantly, from international solidarity perspective, China's willingness to facilitate China-Africa security cooperation is even stronger. Security assistance, as His Excellency Ambassador Chen has just now mentioned, has been provided to Africa under the framework of FOCAC of the UN Peace and Development Trust Fund of the Belt and Road Initiative. And such assistance will be provided for sure. And the third opportunity, in my personal view, is that the strategic competition between or among the major powers has its ceiling. The China-America strategic competition not only has their internal resistances, respectively, but also face oppositions from the international community in general and Africa in particular. So in this regard, I think that I want to make three policy recommendations, mainly for China, for Chinese side. The first is to strengthen the Africa-China cooperation on early warning and crisis management, with a focus on the building of the continental early warning system and the construction of the African Human Security Index in particular, all outlined by the African Agenda 2063. And the second suggestion is to focus more on the security development leg source assistance. I want to emphasize on the leg source. That means between the security and the development, to link security, peace, and development together. Such assistance with the China-Africa Peace and Security Cooperation Fund at the core, and also the partnership for African development. And the third, the final suggestion is to further strengthen support to African peace and security architecture, APSA, for nurturing bigger African ownership for security governance, as Ambassador Sukro just now mentioned, with technical assistance, with capacity building at the core. So this all above is my personal view. Thanks for your attention, and I hope this seminar a great success. Thank you.
Much, Professor Zhang, and I'm sure we'll be getting quite a number of questions about the mirror effect, seeing strategic competition as both an opportunity and a challenge in China-Africa security relations. We have noted clearly the three challenges you raised, the opportunities as well, which are interactive and cooperative in nature, but also the recommendations that you bring forth, which very much mirror some of the recommendations which fall within one of the areas which Ambassador Suklal spoke about, which is China's engagement with the African Union and capitalization on the FOCAC framework for promoting African-China security cooperation. At this point, I would like to invite our final speaker, Sanusha. Sanusha, I mean, I'm sure you have some very interesting takes about China-Africa Security Cooperation. You have the floor.
Good day, Chair. Good day to ambassadors, my colleague from China, all protocol observed. And let me also thank the ISS for the invitation and also congratulate them on their 30-year anniversary. I think it's a very fascinating discussion, having listened to the ambassadors as well as to my colleague in China, and just trying to formulate, how important the security architecture is in the context of China's relationship with Africa, but also Africa's relationship with China. We heard a lot about how China is understanding this architecture, how it's innovating on this relationship in terms of the peace and security and development engagement with African countries, the platforms that have been created, the whole question around the resources, both financial and non-financial resources that have been made available for Africa's peace and security development. I think more importantly, we've got to also ask the question of how Africa looks at this peace and security architecture, and what is the kind of dynamics and dimension that Africa brings in terms of what it seeks to achieve in this relationship with China around the peace and security architecture. So with your indulgence, Chair, and I think I have about 7 minutes, if I could just make 3 broad points and then we can go to the discussion. The first point I want to make is the idea that we've been asked to reflect on the critical components of the security cooperation between Africa and China. I think what has been done so eloquently by my 3 colleagues, including the 2 ambassadors, is the fact that you now have a moment in the China-Africa relationship where China is really, really taking on the mantle of how important peace, security, and development is in the engagement with African countries. If we ask the question from the African side, I think Africa is also realizing that in the broader scheme of the global architecture and where the debates are both normative as well as practical, as well as in the context of multilateralism on the peace and security architecture within the UN system, what's happening in terms of the relationships that are crafted in terms of peace and security, I think the bigger question for Africa is how do you take these resources in light of scarce resources and utilize them in a manner where you kind of, put your resources in areas that are going to be really important and strategic and pragmatic. I think the concept or the idea for the longest time ever about capacitating Africa's standby force has been a key interlocker for most external partners, but also in the context of how Africa relates to each other, the different regions, the different regional blocks. So for example, the regional bloc of Southern Africa, the regional bloc of West Africa, of course in East Africa, and of course in the broader Central African region. And I think that early warning system is critical because in the context of scarce resources, in the context where the peacekeeping agenda and the peacekeeping resources that have kind of become much more harder to come by, I think Africa now given this opportunity to understand how to resource themselves. But don't get caught up in the same old narrative that it's about what the other actor wants. You've got to be able to direct these resources in a malleable, in a pragmatic way, and in a very strategic way in terms of saying, this is what we want to do, especially if you take the argument that it's African solution to African problems. The second point I want to make on this is both sides, the African side and China, need to also be very aware of who the actors are in the peace process. in the stability and development process. If you're talking about negotiating, if you're talking about supporting political settlements, then we've got to take lessons from what has happened in the context of South Africa's experience around the negotiated settlement, the relationships South Africa has developed in Africa through its peace and stability angle, and also learning from what these experiences were. And those experiences are very often, we may be talking to stakeholders who are part of the need to be part of the peace negotiations, the peace brokering, and the peace engagement. But sometimes, and often now, in the changing architecture of Africa's peace and stability landscape, there are those that are outside of those processes. And those that are outside of those processes come back to the question of why they're outside and why they're not included. And so you could actually constantly be in a loop in trying to talk to people, because the architecture is so fluid in Africa in terms of whether it's interstate conflict with regional spillovers, intrastate conflict with also regional spillovers, and what Mary Calder calls new wars in Africa or new security threats in Africa. And one of those new security threats is the question of human security, linked not only to the pandemic, but I think linked to a bigger existential crisis that Africa faces, and that is climate change. So climate refugees, climate challenges also are going to perpetuate new impetus around how you develop your peace and stability and your architecture. The third point I want to make, Chair, is the question around whether it is about aligning to the UN only, or is about capacitating the AU that aligns with the UN. And I think the challenge we have is that the UN is a very complex system, and the UN Security Council is a very complicated seat in the UN Council. So I think a major starting point for me is how do we move outside of the UN Security Council? There are going to be very key interests and issues that come to the UN Security Council, and they're going to go through these key multilateral issues. But is the UN Security Council where you want to deliberate on peace and security issues relating to Africa? I think on the question of human rights, on the question of socio-economic rights, on the question of the UN General Assembly, there are other avenues in the UN context that will be very critical to how you materialize and operationalize the Africa-China, China-Africa engagement on peace and security. I want to also say, Chair, that in the context of where we are now, I think China has entered a new level of engagement with Africa around the peace and security. I think we saw this gradual engagement with regard to FOCAC when it started in 2000, to how it emerged and evolved in terms of 2006, where it was a critical moment where it was the Heads of State Summit, and then how it evolved again when we saw the Belt Road Initiative. And this brings us to where the Belt Road Initiative intersects with FOCAC. I think it's very important to understand that these initiatives are not separate, but they are synergetic, and they have intersections that we need to look at in terms of peace and security and engagement. And one of those is not just around the maritime security, but the security of overland transport corridors, making sure that if you're thinking about maritime security, you've got to also think about the backward linkages to your rail, to your infrastructure, but also where the pulse points and the choke points are, not only in shipping lanes, but choke points that do exist and have existed for the longest time ever in terms of the regional hinterland. And so if you are a landlocked country, if you're going to be transporting goods, what are the choke points that may affect and impact on security and development? And I think my colleague from China mentioned the political and social architecture and the unpredictability of that. Apart from climate change, I think we've got to recognize that when we talk about governance deficits, we also got to think about institutional deficits and how regional blocs, as well as the AU, are aligning themselves to dealing with the fact that there's a partner in China that's willing to cooperate, partner, and collaborate. But what are the institutional deficits and the governance deficits that need to be plugged in order to make this partnership more realizable, implementable, and operationalized? So for me to end on these points, Chair, I think it's very critical to be careful into looking at the architecture of Africa in a particular lens, through a particular narrative, and more importantly, trying to collate all the issues around peace and security within a particular framework. You've got to understand that the African continent is fragmented, the African continent is diverse, and the issues that are going to be underpinning peace and security are always a moving target. Thank you.
Thank you, Sanusha, for bringing everything home through the identification of the threats which face not only Africa, but the globe. These are threats which are enduring, they are evolving, they are dynamic, they are multinational. And so solving threats in one place might very well solve them in other spaces as well. Thanks for flagging the issue on governance as well. Governance, which is a question of not just capabilities, but also abilities, political will and capacities, and knowing again the actor whom you have in front of you. And it brings us to a very rational engagement about who the actors are, what they want out of this engagement, and what lessons we can draw from previous engagements as well. So at this point, the rules of engagement are, at least for us within the framework of this panel, there have been a lot of discussions taking place online as well that we would be able to zero in on. But we also would be joined by Minister Councillor Yu Yong from the Chinese Embassy here in Pretoria to engage with us on some of the questions which have emerged online. I would not want to abuse my role as chair to ask the first question, so I'll hand over to my colleague Gustavo, who has been monitoring the pulse of discussions online. Gustavo, what's happening on Twitter and on the other platforms?
Thanks very much, Font, and thank you for the panelists for really fantastic presentations that draw a lot of engagement and discussions around quite interesting issues, I think, in terms of Africa-China security cooperation. And I'm raising 4 or 5 points that I thought were quite central in those discussions that would be interesting to hear more from our panelists. And essentially one of the issues, and there was a lot of comments around that, is bringing the Africa-China cooperation into a broader global context where Africa is engaging with a number of other powers. We heard from the speakers issues around South-South cooperation and the issue around how the issue of demand-driven supports and aid and development and economics and security after intertwined. But some of our participants actually have been asking about how different it is to what other southern countries do, how different is Africa-China security cooperation to what Africa has with the European Union, with the United Kingdom, with the US, with Japan, with Turkey, with Brazil, with India, and all of these other players that are in the continent, which somehow links to some of the issues that we saw in the panel, from the panelist speeches today on this idea of economic development as a key driver for long-term stability. But to some extent, what does it mean, this idea of trade, not aid, and how different that is from what actually happens in reality, particularly where these actors are often playing a role in a fairly competitive and or overlapping manner. The second issue is this, what was also mentioned by some of the panelists, and we had some discussions around that, regards what Sanusha was mentioning now around the diversity within the continent. And there's somehow balance that needs to be made between bilateral engagement with China and specific African member states, but also the use of multilateral forums in that. So what do we see in terms of this, what balance can be met between forums like FOCAC that brings an entire continent? There was some interesting discussions on social media last week around why do we have a whole continent talking to specific countries, and China is not unique on that. But how are we going to be able to find a balance on that? The third issue, and I think it's something that brings to what Sanusha was mentioning now, that is about ownership and agency. A lot of the discussions come from the role of China in Africa, but how are Africans themselves within this issue of diversity driving agency and ownership and driving the agenda to make sure that the interests of the continent of specific countries are met, but particularly to ensure, and there is a lot of this issue around what are the dividends for the regular Africans on the ground? How is this relationship between several different countries in the continent with China is not only benefiting these often state-to-state relations, but it's trickling down to become much more of a people-centered approach. And the final 2 points, I think, that came there, and I don't want to abuse much of my time, so we still have time for the speakers to share that. One is when it comes to the issue of intentionality around this issue, linkage between development, peace, and security. We talk often around the intertwined approach, but how do we know that those economic and development activities are not only providing dividends to the African citizens on the ground, but also that are responding to longer term priorities that deals with sustainable peace and development. Final question is very, very, very punctual, is that how will China-Africa Security Cooperation feature within this year's FOCAC? And I think it's a very straightforward question, but I think it's a question that is important for us to reflect considering Senegal's meeting next month. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Gustavo. And I would go back to the panelists. I mean, very important questions were raised. For a quick fire round for the panelists to take about a minute or two to reflect on a number of issues. I'll go to the embassy first. Minister Councillor Yu, what lessons can we draw from 21 years of FOCAC to inform China-Africa Security Cooperation going forward?
Thank you, Chair. It's my great honor on behalf of Ambassador Chen to express our congratulations to you for the 30 years anniversary of the ISS First. Over the past 20 years, as many panelists and also the comments have mentioned, China and Africa has enjoyed a very comprehensive, high level and very good relationship scaling up in all areas, especially in security and peace. Within the framework of African peace architecture and also the Chinese African Cooperation Forum, like the FOCAC, BRI, and the Peace Initiative for African Development. We are expecting more practical and results-oriented cooperation within this year's FOCAC. I'm very glad that both China and African side, they're working very hard to working a very excellent paper. The outcome paper for this FOCAC. Besides the declaration and action plan, I heard that there will be quite a number of specific papers which just echoes our colleagues' concern on how to look at the intervening relationship between peace, security, development, and all other challenges we are facing today. I believe China and Africa's cooperation in all these areas will give a very good hand to solve the peace and the conflict, all the challenges like terror or terrorism, and this will build a more solid foundation for our future cooperation. China will import more resources and give more priority to the cooperation in this area. I can assure you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Minister Councillor Yu. And thanks for emphasizing the results-based orientation of the upcoming FOCAC engagement. I would like to turn now to Ambassador Dr. Suhlal to raise an interesting question about alignment in engagement with China. From the bilateral level, say South Africa. South Africa has bilateral engagements with China, but SADC could also have engagements with China, and the AU could have engagements with China. How do we ensure that there is alignment of South Africa's rational foreign policy interest across the chain of engagement, from bilateral engagement all the way to multilateral engagement?
Thank you, Chair. Chair, I think there's already an architecture in place. If you look at FOCAC, FOCAC is the coming together of African countries and China. The implementation of the decisions that emanate from summit, the action plan, that's implemented on multiple levels. It's not implemented specifically through the AU Commission. The AU Commission is just another member of FOCAC like the other sovereign countries. It's implemented to the regional economic communities through the AU Commission, and importantly, through the bilateral mechanism of the respective countries. So I believe this is exactly the architecture that should be replicated when dealing with security. Security is one dimension of the total cooperation between Africa and China. Yes, it must be coordinated, and we don't see a conflict. As South Africa, we are very much part of FOCAC. We co-chaired FOCAC for 6 years, 2012, 2018, and very involved with it from its beginning. But the implementation of FOCAC is working very well. It has to be implemented through these multifold platforms that we are using. Likewise with security. The other important point to understand is that the African security architecture is complex. You have all major role players involved there, like you have with the rest of the world and the forum they have with Africa, be it EU Africa, India Africa, FOCAC, TICAD, or whatever, all of these platforms. The important point is for Africa to be in the driving seat of these partnership and cooperation initiatives, to ensure that they each complement each other and not duplicate each other and not become a field of contestation. The continent does not become the casualty as a result of all of the role players wanting to work with the continent, be it bilaterally, multilaterally, or through the African Union or through the RECs. I think it's important for us as individual member states, as RECs and the Commission to ensure this coordination, including in the security domain. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Ambassador. I would like to, and thanks for highlighting the necessity to deepen engagement through existing frameworks to get the alignment that we seek. I would like to then turn to Professor Zhang, quick fire round as well to you, Professor. The ambassador challenged us a few minutes ago about the need for knowledge systems to actually accompany these kinds of state engagements. Do you think that there is enough knowledge production in China about Africa or in Africa about China to be able to create a platform for informed decision-making to accompany processes which seem to have outpaced knowledge production and policy generation?
Okay, thanks, Dr. Aku. It's really a very difficult question. I think that I try to link your questions with other questions. For example, how the economic development linked to the security improvement. I think that China's practice maybe produce new knowledges because our approach, this is also a lot of question. Our approach is totally different with other countries. The difference is that China pursue development first approach to practice the China-Africa security cooperation to link the economic development with the security improvement. How this approach can be productive? The logic is, if you put your limited resources into security only or many, then because security itself cannot produce new resources. So if you stop to input new resources or you cut down the resources you inject into security area, then the security situation may be dropped down again. However, if we link economic development with security cooperation, we inject majority resources into economic development, then you will have more resources to support your security improvement. So this benevolent cycle will produce, we call, lasting peace or lasting security. Then a benevolent cycle emerged. I think this is a new knowledge for security, for governance, for development, for the nexus between peace, security, development, and governance even. So this is my short answer. I don't know whether meet your request, but I think that there has great potential for knowledge creation, for security improvement, and for China-Africa cooperation in general. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, for underlying the importance of knowledge production to support and to engage with these processes. And Sanusha, I'm coming back to you with, I think, what would be a rather interesting question. We have heard about the promise of a common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable approach driving China's engagement with Africa. Do you think that would effectively move us towards a preventive agenda which provides early responses to some of the threats that Africa faces? Or does it place us in the reactive point where we are coming in with peace support operations and coming in after the security threats have already become full-blown crisis?
Thanks, Chair. It's a complex question, I have to say, because the debate on early warning systems and standby forces in Africa, whether it's regional blocs, whether it's the AU, has always been that contentious debate. You know, for example, if you look at Guinea, if I take Guinea as an example of what has transpired there in the last couple of weeks, you know, how well prepared was ECOWAS in determining the status quo and what was changing? What were the structural conditions that saw the shift emerge that allowed for that coup to take place? And I think if you amplify that argument across other areas of the continent, you have to understand the continent is not homogeneous. It is defined by very complex and heterogeneous issues and landscapes. So I think at the end of the day, the point about an early warning system is how well it is ventilated, and more importantly, how well it percolates in who is monitoring and how well you communicate the information that you're getting and translate it into pulse checks in terms of whether or not it is happening in the context of saying, well, here is something we need to watch very carefully, because the impact of that instability is going to have a regional and if not a continental spillover. And the second point I want to make to that is who you're monitoring in the early warning system, because you could be monitoring people who you see are the insurgents or the extra state actors or actors that are outside of the state architecture. But at the same time, if you're monitoring people on the ground who are essentially not finding the linkages, you know, the point that Gustavo made about how do you get this dividend down to grassroots? How do you ensure that the stability and the development and the indicators that determine what the development agenda is being achieved? If that's not happening, then you end up with this instability on the ground, this grassroots instability. And is it an insurgence? Is it a threat? Is it a threat against the state or the state architecture? Or is it the fact that people are frustrated because they've been excluded from inclusive development?
Thank you very much, Sanusha. And I would like to seize this opportunity to thank everyone who joined us today. And unfortunately, we could have just one round of questions here. We have many more questions and many conversations to continue with online, but we are comforted by the fact that this is a two-day event which actually takes us through looking at China-Africa cooperation in relation to the Belt and Road Initiative, but also China-Africa cooperation within the multilateral system. And that would allow us to touch upon and unpack the five issue areas which Ambassador Sulal brought to the fore. It would also allow us to dig deeper into reflecting on the position that the Ambassador Chen actually presented. A couple of days ago, President Xi actually made a commitment to China going carbon neutral by 2060, which was quite a commitment to hear on the stage at the UN General Assembly, and we'll be engaging with that as well. We could not do justice to the theme of China-Africa cooperation within just an hour and a half, but we hope that we have generated enough debate and thought which would inform the agenda at the upcoming FOCAC summit, but which would also provide food for thought for our intellectuals like Professor Zhang and Sanusha as well. Thank you very much for joining us today, and I would like to hand over to my colleague, Gustavo.
Thank you very much. And just for those of you colleagues following us online, our next session on Africa-China security cooperation and the implications of the Belt and Roads Initiative on that relationship will start at 1 p.m. South African Standard Time and 7 p.m. China Standard Time. So thank you very much, and I hope to see you later this afternoon. And tomorrow, the session will start at the same time as today, 10 a.m. South African Time and 4 p.m. China Standard Time. Thank you very much.